All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for attending. My name is James Grass. I lead the Accenture North America Advanced DevOps Center. We put this group together to share all things DevOps and what's latest in this space. We're always looking for speakers, so if you're interested, please drop me a note. Earlier this week, we also got the DevOps Days Tampa Bay folks together to talk about how to pull off a DevOps Days 2021. So if you're interested in helping organize, please give me a ring or drop me a note and we'll get you connected to the right people. Just as a reminder, this will be a recorded event and posted on YouTube. Quick guidelines, please stay on mute unless you're asking a question. Roger does want to be interrupted during the event. So if you have a question for him, please ask. We encourage video. It helps make everything feel more socially engaging. And we'll also open it up at the end for any additional questions if you don't want to ask during the actual event as well. Today, JFrog's going to be giving away some SwampUp main conference premium add-on passes for us, and a chance to win a free Amazon Echo or a Baby Yoda Lego set. I'm going to pass it over to Ari, and he's going to give us a little bit more details of that.
Thanks, James. I appreciate it. And yeah, it's going to be the Amazon Echo show today for sure. Hey, everybody. My name is Ari Waller, and I do work for JFrog. I'm on the developer relations team as their meetup event manager. And I really appreciate James allowing me to make an announcement about our upcoming global DevOps conference, SwampUp 2021. For those who may not know a lot about us, I'll just share briefly who we are. JFrog, we're a DevOps software company. We were founded in 2008. Many people in the DevOps community know us best by our flagship product, Artifactory, which is considered by many to be the gold standard for managing your artifacts and dependencies. But here's something that you may not know yet. JFrog has a free cloud version of our software available for you to use for your projects. If you're working with Docker, as I know many of you are, JFrog's free tier on the cloud is capable of functioning as a pull-through cache for Docker Hub. And here's the best part. Since JFrog has partnered with Docker, you'll be exempt from their rate limits on pulls from free or anonymous accounts. Also, I'll share a quick slide here with you as well. Like James said, our annual DevOps conference, SwampUp 2021. Can everyone see that okay?
I can see it.
Great. Is coming May 25th to the 27th in the Americas and June 1st and 3rd in EMEA and APAC. And JFrog wants you to get in for free. Besides this sample of some of the amazing speakers from many of the companies you would expect to see in the DevOps world, we also have an executive panel with the CEOs from HashiCorp, PagerDuty, Datadog, Elastic. You all probably know Alan Schimmel, and of course, Shlomi Ben Chaim, who's our CEO at JFrog. It's going to be a pretty awesome panel as well. Our theme this year is DevOps in the epicenter, with a goal of empowering you with really things that you can take back to work with you and use cases that are going to help you to drive DevOps. And it's for developers, DevOps engineers, security professionals, and IT leaders. You can scan the QR code here, and this will put in automatically the code that you need for an extra day pass. So day one is when we have the training offerings for people. The main conference day, which is free, is day 2. Day 3 is going to be a add-on ticket, which does cost $49, but for DevOps, for Tampa Bay DevOps, you will get in for free if you scan this QR code or use the bit.ly, which I'll also drop in the chat in a few moments. And I'll drop how it works too. It's not complex. I'm sure if all of you are DevOps engineers, you will figure this one out. The secondly also is we will enter for a chance to win the Amazon Echo Show. If you don't have one of these, they're really cool. My kids spend as much time on these as much as they do on their televisions or devices. They're really, really intuitive and smart and a lot of fun. What we'll do is I wish I could do live drawings. Unfortunately, from compliance standpoint, I can't. But that being said, we will pick somebody randomly And when we do that, we will be contacted within 3 business days. And then the winner will be shared. I will contact them by email, and the winner will be shared with the entire Tampa Bay DevOps community. We'll congratulate you on social, etc. So again, thank you so much James for letting me stop by today and share about the conference. And I really appreciate it. And we're looking forward to hearing Roger's talk.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Ari.
Thank you.
And for, just getting right to it, Roger, I'm going to introduce Roger. He's an Agile coach and thought leader for SolutionsIQ, which is a specialized area within Accenture that focuses on Agile practice and Agile transformations for our clients. We're going to be talking about how to do true CI/CD with BDD. So Roger, if you want to take it over.
Sure, just give me a second to share out here and figure out why you are insisting, why my calendar is insisting on giving okay, there we go. So hi everybody, welcome. I'm actually gonna not start with a deck just now. Give me a second to go over, and I've got a Menti because I just wanna, I realize that I am probably talking to a more technical crowd than I normally talk to. I came up as a developer. I'm now an Agile coach, and I want to just start with getting a sense for where you are, because it'll definitely change the nature of the conversation. So if you can all just go to Menti and on a scale of 1 to 10, rate your familiarity with behavior-driven development. With one end, you're Seb Rose or John Ferguson Smart or something like that. And on the other hand, it's like, what's that? And I don't have a cool giveaway for this one. So, okay.
Oh, Roger, looks like we're getting quite the mix here.
I think this is what you call a distribution of results. So we got what, 5?
Could you please share the URL one more time?
www.menti.com.
Oh, okay, I see that.
And there's the code. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
And thanks. Yeah, and thanks for asking. Because I am so used to doing this with just about every meeting that I go into. Yeah, menti.com, and there's the code that'll get you to the question. Wow, 2 people have never heard of it. Okay.
Actually, that's me, and I checked too, but it popped up to never heard of it. Okay.
Okay, no worries. I mean, I'm sorry that happened. It really, it's fine. Okay, we'll take another few seconds, get responses. We've got, okay, so it seems like we've got a little bit of a grouping down in the not too strong on it. Seb Rose did not grace us with his presence. I'm not at all surprised by that. And then we have a whole bunch of people who are actually fairly strong, at least with an understanding of it. And it looks like that is it. Okay, so and we got another. We've got a wide range. So I'm gonna ask your indulgence, those of you who are maybe more familiar with it. Hopefully I will tell you something about it that you don't know, but I can't guarantee that. And one of the nice things about being an Agile coach is people do not invite me in to look at their organizations because they're doing such a wonderful job, right? So, and let's go in another direction. Continuous integration. This is the Tampa DevOps group. And I'll give just a minute or two to pop some answers into here. Okay, we got some experts in the room. Okay, so if I'm reading the room right, it seems like you know a little bit more about continuous integration in general. Generally, this group knows a little bit more about continuous integration than you know about BDD. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's fair.
Okay. And now the fun thing, because you always have to check this stuff. What's your definition of it? And we'll take just a minute on this one. Just quick, bam, pocket definition of CI.
You check in code, machine somewhere else compiles the code, runs a unit test, and if the build breaks, it emails or maybe notifies the team.
Okay, so it is code elsewhere. It's a machine elsewhere building the code.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
notifying the team if it breaks.
yeah.
Okay, is that anyone want to agree, disagree with that?
Would add artifacts as well, producing an artifact. If it
Producing
is
an artifact,
less
okay.
successful.
Yeah, it puts it in a drop folder so that those items could be used for a continuous delivery.
All right, anyone else want to volunteer a? Some people are throwing it into the Menti, but
Oh,
you can talk about. You can also talk about it here. Code quality, okay. All right, this is interesting. Actually, this is really interesting. Okay, I'm gonna no unresolved conflicts. That's good. And whoever wrote no unresolved conflicts, how do you make sure that there are no unresolved conflicts?
That is always that I wrote it, and that's always the point of concern. I don't know that there's anybody who is able to do that consistently.
I mean,
but typically it's done through at least in my experience, it's done through a centralized or centralized build location, and no direct deploys from like developer sandboxes to active production, or controlled deploys so that anything gets resolved before it actually gets into production.
okay, interesting. All right, so let's move on. I think I see enough. So I'm gonna say I'm going to get to what is actually the definition of continuous integration, but I'd say right now, all due respect to the people who are putting yourself at an 8 or a 9, just short of having taught Dave Farley all he knows about it, your definition leaves a little bit to be desired. It's not quite the full definition of continuous integration. Continuous integration is always an interesting one for me, because it's one that a lot of people talk about and they don't necessarily know what they're talking about. So let's move forward. And that's no insult, because believe me, you're in really, really good company. So here's what the talk is about today. And I think this should spark some interesting conversation. I was a little afraid, because everyone was so techie today, that this might be boring for some of you, but I don't think it's going to be. So basically, it is why you don't necessarily need something like behavior-driven development. But first, I'm going to teach you what behavior-driven development is, teach you what continuous integration and continuous deployment is, and then we're going to connect the dots. At least that's my intention, from why one kind of relies on the other. So introducing myself, I am Roger Turnau. I've been with Accenture SolutionsIQ practice since 2018. I came up as a techie and, was one of those weird kids who started programming at age 11. Did a text-based adventure game at my local college with my brother when I was really, really young. Became a professional coder in 1995. Snuck off to get an MFA in creative writing from Florida State, and that's why I'm here in Tallahassee. And I would say I would define myself as being just about manic about test-driven development and behavior-driven development. It's not, again, I'm probably being talked out of some of the extreme fervor, but both approaches have always worked for me, and I'll walk you through why. So first, let's get around to defining. So continuous delivery, first of all, this is kind of the larger issue that we have. And continuous delivery, I just see as being the ability to create the shortest possible path between, hey, I have an idea for something I'd like, and working software that's out in production. And very, very many of our organizations, they kind of take the long way to get there. They'll have lengthy regression cycles. They'll do an awful lot of manual testing, and basically the continuous delivery is the attempt to get to here, where bam, it just happens. You're out in production, and it literally is the shortest possible line. And the companies that are able to do this right, this gets talked about a lot in DevOps circles, but I don't think that there's an awful lot of good knowledge out there in the industry about how to actually put this together. And I've kind of made that a little bit of a crusade. So, you have more time to spend on new features, which, in a perfect world, and probably even in an imperfect world, makes you more money if you're an organization. The companies that can do this have 50% higher market cap growth over 3 years, 8,000 times faster deployment lead. Stop me if you've heard all this, because I would expect at a DevOps meetup, you've probably seen everything like this. It really does change the game. But, and there's a big but, there's a couple of things you have to know how to do. And again, we're looking to connect the dots. Now, continuous integration. I would say, this is one that I would say, congratulations, you all got part of the way there without getting the entire way there. Continuous integration is defined as developers integrating code into a shared repository frequently, preferably several times a day. And when I mean integrating into a shared repository, I don't mean a branch off of GitHub. Git flow style is kind of a bad word where I'm from. You really do want to integrate your code into Trunk if possible. You should realize immediately, so this is the part that you absolutely did get right. You should realize immediately if there are any issues with the code being deployed. And the whole idea is that you want to see immediately if there are problems and make it easier to get rid of those problems. And again, this takes a little bit of, of heavy lifting to do. Now, continuous deployment. Before I go on to this, I've got one last question to ask you about the organizations that you're in. How often is your organization able to deploy code to production? And I've got less than a quarter, every month, every day, more than once a day. Okay. Monthly seems to be pretty standard. Oh, okay. Congratulations to more than once a day crowd. All right, and while people are filling in, the people who are doing it every day or more than once a day, I want to give you an opportunity. Can you talk to what you feel like is enabling that?
Well, having to build pipeline.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, my answer would have been too long to submit it, but so I work at State Farm. Usually when we submit for code review, and once the production environment's set up, then we could deploy multiple times in production throughout every day. It's just, if we have a stage in a dev environment. So usually But for code review, that initial push is not there. But once we get the code review and then we're in production, we can deploy multiple times because you have a pipeline on every single
Okay.
check domain.
Yeah, and State Farm is fairly advanced with this stuff. I've heard stories I've known from people who work there. They do actually have their DevOps game up.
Okay.
Anybody else want to talk about what's, you know, what makes the difference for your team? Okay, so it seems like we got a few every quarter, every month. These days, if you're still back in the every quarter, every month, you're kind of struggling with this stuff. And you know, I noticed a lot of people didn't weigh in. That's fine. Every day, more than once a day, is really what you're aiming for. And ideally, you'd like it going either all the way to production, or let's say there's an instance where you can't. So let's talk about continuous deployment and how it differs from continuous delivery. So continuous delivery is your stuff is always ready to be deployed. You may or may not deploy it. You know, you may or not actually deploy it out to production, but it's always ready to be deployed. Well, that's continuous delivery. And why might you not want to deploy every day to production? Well, you know, if I'm driving my Tesla down the road, I don't want it suddenly deploying, you know, I don't want it suddenly deploying to my car before I'm stopped and maybe recharging the battery. I want to control that, you know, on my phone, I want to control what that is. So, but with continuous deployment, you're basically saying, nope, I want it out there right there. I am provisioning an API. I know it's not going to have any breaking changes. Bam, it goes out as soon as possible, right? Deployed, very importantly, is not the same thing as released. Teams that are able to do this the teams that are able to deploy every day, they kind of have to figure this out. And again, I mean, if you're deploying every day to production, it's not the same thing as releasing code. You need some way to keep the code off to the side. All right, so let's talk about behavior-driven development. So I would say this is not necessarily everybody's current state of development, but this does tend to be. We tend to ship things very, very broken, certainly with the clients that I work with. And like I said, the clients I work with, they're a little behind the curve. You know, I've worked with a couple of clients that have months-long deployment processes, and it is heavy, and it is ugly, and it's awful. And they basically ship with defects. It's increasingly expensive to fix code, and as a result, their code is worthless pretty soon. Any system that they ship out, it amortizes over 3 years, and that's kind of an accounting standard. So why would you use a test-first practice like test-driven development and behavior-driven development? Well, it's because of technical debt, which is something that we all ought to be intimately familiar with. In the normal way we do things, we tend to put a lot of pressure on development teams to crank things out quickly. And how do you crank things out quickly? Well, you start developing, it starts really cheap. You basically get a couple templates up, you add a new feature, you keep adding features. And if you're not paying attention to self-managing technical debt, the cost of every new feature you have, especially if your stuff is designed crappily, is going to be more and more expensive to add in. And this is why an awful lot of even Agile shops, if they're using Scrum or something like that, after a year and a half, they suddenly find their velocity is slowing down. They basically have not paid attention to technical practices, and their stuff gets, then they turn around and they do the test, because we realize that this thing is a battle hardened but piece of junk. So they throw in a lot of unit tests, but then it's a little too late. It's like you really need to invest in turning this down. So TDD and BDD kind of work differently. There's a million ways to do this wrong, but here's how it ought to work, and here's how I have experienced it working. You basically start out, and there's a long ramp up time while you're learning how to do it. You're basically start with high development costs, and development runs very, very, very slowly. But over time, you can guarantee that adding a new thing in there is not going to break anything old. And because of the test coverage and because of the quality of your test coverage, your stuff, and when it goes into maintenance, which most software is going to spend 80% of its time living, there's very little technical debt. And the technical debt is basically self-managing. It's a much easier system to work with. And this is one of the things that I talk with teams about a lot, because they resist, because it's a lot of tests. Management doesn't really give us enough time. I can kind of walk you through how to do this stuff in a short amount of time. What I can't really give a team is the idea of what this looks like years later when you've done it right. And the when you've done it right is a big thing, because a lot of teams get themselves, they dig themselves into holes, they overmock, they do a whole bunch of stuff, and their code actually doesn't reap the benefits. But if you're doing it correctly, and if you're doing it with an eye to quality, then your stuff ought to just manage itself. Test-driven development, we've probably all heard of it. This is where eyes tend to roll. I kind of think of myself as the person who's recommending that you exercise and eat more vegetables, in development. I'm not selling you a tool that's going to make this magically easier, but basically it's the whole idea that you write a test before you write code for that test. And what it ensures is, by writing the test up front, you have a falsifiable test. You have a test that at least at some point in its life has failed. And that's incredibly important, because what a lot of testers will do is they'll start gaming the stats. They'll have, we need to get to 80% code coverage. Great. I'm gonna create a test that runs a whole bunch of code, and then you'll get to the end and it's assert true. You have a test that's basically lying to you and is worthless and is vampirically draining your code quality. And it's kind of difficult to find those, although you can find them with mutation test tools like PyTest. I think there's Striker in JavaScript, and there's probably more of those coming out. But basically the whole idea behind this is, if you are not writing tests alongside your code, then Michael Feathers would say you're writing legacy code. Code is not guaranteed to do what it's supposed to do unless you ship tests with it. And let's also reframe it for value. My system needs to be self-documenting. I need to have some guarantee that when I change something over here, it's not going to break something over here. And all too often, that's not a reality that we can get to. And honestly, if you're working in a shop where that is a reality and everyone's figured it out, good for you. You're still a relative rarity out there in the field. So, quick buzz on how unit testing is different from TDD. With unit testing, you basically develop, you check, you develop, you check, you develop, you check. And then what happens in the middle here is you get under time pressure, develop, because your deadlines are coming up, and those deadlines are oh so important, right? And then you realize, okay, now I need to write unit tests, and at this point, you've gone too far down the path. You don't necessarily know. You didn't write your stuff to be testable to begin with, which is a bit of an art and a science. And TDD helps you do that. Again, if you can find another way other than TDD to work that way, I say go crazy. But TDD is one of those like bedrock practices. It is, it's unpopular in some circles, but I've not seen anything else that gives the same level of value. Whereas with TDD, because you're always writing the test first, everything you write as a developer is guaranteed to have a test. That is a meaningful test. And basically what this enables, it manages your technical debt for you. Your stuff does not get more expensive. And I'm going to stop there and see if anyone has any questions, comments, complaints. What the hell are you talking about? Things like that.
Completely agree. Like, I didn't even know what dependency injection was until I saw a TED talk on unit testing. The guy said, like, you shouldn't have new in your code. I'm like, don't new up something, because you're creating a compile time dependency. So say you have a do something method and you new up service one that does do whatever.
Yeah.
So if you try to create a test for that, it's really an integration test. If you want to isolate that one method, it forces you to decouple it, make it cleaner. So you nailed it on the head. If you wait after a couple of sprints to add tests after the fact, maybe you're doing dependency injection, maybe you're using interfaces the whole time. But to me, a unit test is like a stencil, a barometer you should have it every so often, because if you wait too long to have it, maybe you got it, you created it testable by having just by knowing about interfaces and dependency injection, but it's not a good idea to wait multiple sprints, because you're not going to go back. I told the guy I'm kind of mentoring now, like, do it either do it right after the sprint or try to do it right to test first, because you're not going to do it.
And yeah, and if you don't do it, it never gets done, and you never quite know what's in there. I couldn't agree more. Every developer has that system that you worked on that you were like, what the hell just happened there? Mine, it was a system that my team inherited. I swear to God, this thing had 3 separate subsystems to call one database, and nobody who worked on it could remember which one actually called the actual database. Mm-hmm. No unit tests. It was your standard big ball of mud. And I had the fun job of writing up the memo saying, this is basically unmaintainable. And the person who had written it was actually the chief architect of the company. So that made me really popular. Then again, I think I kind of enjoy being the bearer of bad news sometimes. So yeah, this is true. The flip side of this, and what this side kind of talks to is, and I would say, if you're really judicious about how you integration test, I'm okay with a little bit of integration testing, but you do have to be careful with it. So, and I'm sorry, what's your name? You are?
Charles.
Charles. Okay, thanks, Charles. You need to come at it with a good idea of what solid design looks like, or whatever the corollary for that is in the system that you're working in. You don't, a lot of people who are big on TDD, to my mind, oversell the design benefits. It ought to help you get a better design, but it does not necessarily help you get a better design. And I really, really, really wish that the people who hype TDD owned that one a little bit more, because I think that that's one thing. It's like, you need to take the view of your system that it's like you're going to design it in a way that is just anti-fragile, that just it takes care of itself. And we'll get in very soon to why that is absolutely required for doing continuous integration. And okay, all right. If you have an awful lot of lengthy regression cycles at your place of work, you're probably, nobody's doing TDD. And you really need to tell teams it's not enough to fix a defect. Fixing a defect is great, but I also want, personally, when I'm writing a system, to guarantee that that defect is never coming back again. Because it bite me once, nope, you're not going to bite me down the road. I am going to write a test, and I'm going to make sure that I'm guarded against that. So that's TDD. I often talk about TDD before I talk about BDD, and that is because I've worked with organizations that have this huge push for BDD and never address what TDD is. And what you end up with is an awful lot of confused developers who think that who think that testing is this managerial level thing where the managers get together and talk about things a lot, and then tests are never written. So I kind of take the opposite way. I see behavior-driven development as being kind of a superset over test-driven development. So with that said, what is behavior-driven development? And for those of you who already know this stuff cold, this will be a little bit boring for you, but basically, when Dan North and Chris Matz were working in ThoughtWorks in 2006, they were working with a client who was having trouble adopting TDD. They didn't know where to start, didn't know what to and what not to test. What not to test is also real art. What you can get away with not testing is one of those things that you just kind of learn after doing it for a while. Don't know how much to test in one attempt. Don't know what to call their tests. Don't understand why a test fails. And also, I would add in there this belief, completely mistaken, that TDD somehow requires you to write all the tests before you write any code. That is not the case. You write a test for whatever it is you anticipate doing. And by the way, if that's driving down a blind alley that you find you don't want to go back on, you can get rid of the test, get rid of the production code, back your way out. It's just you kind of scaffold your tests up as you scaffold the code. So their answer to the problem of people not understanding test-driven development was they decided one of language. So they basically created a couple rules around it. The whole convention, and excuse my dogs, hey. All right. So one of the conventions they added, you see this all the time now, is should do blah. Right. They stopped calling it tests. They started calling it a specification, which is an interesting distinction because a specification tells you what your system ought to do. Right. A test could be anything. You know, my kids have tests all the time. Right. They didn't call them test cases anymore. They called them scenarios, which is that one I could take it or leave it. And then they proposed the given when then model to model what tests ought to do. And basically, given when then, if you don't know what's called Gherkin, it's basically just a formalization of what developers call the arrange, act, assert pattern, where you set up what you're going to do ahead of time, you do what you're going to do, and then you test that what happened was actually what happened. I don't generally like process diagrams, but if you want a process diagram about what to do, and that's because in Agile, it's about individuals and interactions rather than processes and tools. And sometimes people get a process like, ooh, we got a process, and now we can just follow this. And it's not anywhere near that easy. You know, the whole idea is that you start around with the business where you're discovering what your systems ought to look like. You take it to to kind of your product team, a little bit of your developers, and you define it down a little bit more. You formalize what the tests are going to look based on a shared understanding that you're creating. And then you have this outer loop of automated acceptance testing. Those would be your BDD level tests. And then this inner loop that your developers are doing all the time of write a test, write some code, write a test, write some code, write a code, write some tests. It does not replace TDD, doing BDD. And again, what is doing BDD? Getting there. And then you deliver it, hopefully very, very fast. So BDD is two central things. It is creating a ubiquitous language so that everyone in an organization understands your problem domain. And then you deliver a system that is driven by a set of executable specifications. In other words, there is no mystery about what the system does. It actually wakes up every build cycle, checks that it's doing what you expected it to do and what it probably did yesterday. It's still doing it, great, it gets to go on. It's not doing it, everybody halts, goes back and fixes something, right? This part is kind of the improvement over TDD, you know, where they add a little bit of language into there, but it's basically the same thing. With TDD, if you're doing it right, it's going to align to what the system ought to do. And somewhere in the back of your mind ought to be the acceptance criteria that you're building toward, but you don't need to necessarily. And over here, this stuff is generally new. This is how things get communicated. And there are a whole raft of great things that I really don't have the scope to go into in this talk about how you define the problem set. You know, when I teach this, it's normally like 4 half days just to go over everything and to walk teams through all of this. I would look up things like example mapping, feature mapping, things like that, because they are really great ways that you can basically get what needs to be tested in a way that everybody understands. And everybody understands what tests are going to be driving your development and going to be driving the proving out that this stuff actually does what you say it's going to do when you deliver the software. That's this part. And together, basically, you improve things if you work on either side of these, but together they are, you know, you might say a fighting force worthy, you know, a worthy opponent, a fighting force terrible to behold, or something like that. They are incredibly powerful if you join them, because now you have this organizational wide understanding of what you need to do, and you have a system that proves that it's doing what that organization needs. It's proving its benefit every single day that you build. Okay, I'm gonna kind of rush through these because these are probably less important, and I want to make sure that I get to how this hooks up to continuous integration, because there's kind of a lot to talk about there. But basically, the one thing that I would call out here is when you test, and this is an anti-pattern that we see a lot when we go out there, a lot of people's gherkins take this implementation-based view of things. Given that I have an order screen, when I hit the button that puts an item into the checkout basket, then blah 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 blah. All the reference to screens, all the reference to buttons, all the reference to calling a database, anything like that, get it out of your gherkins. The test is definitely might be waking up and doing all that as far as the implementation, but test the behavior. I want to check that when I select a product and send it to my basket, that it ends up in my basket. And if I was testing something from 1936 and I didn't have computers and I didn't have a network, I would phrase it the exact same way. I want to make sure that a customer can pick up an item, from Pap's grocery and put it in the basket, and it's in the basket. It's literally the same concept. So keep it at the conceptual level when you're testing that. And ubiquitous language stuff. Again, this is a big thing. It basically is making the creation of tests a full team sport, not just for the developers to figure out. That's not that there's anything wrong with developers. Developers are wonderful. Developers also cut corners. And you really want that large conversation to be happening. All right. How much testing should you end up with? Well, you should end up with, and I've got some pretty good, I've seen some pretty good stats in companies that do this pretty well. You should basically end up with an order of magnitude more unit tests at the unit level, tests that are running from JUnit or NUnit or whatever, whatever you're using in JavaScript, like, Jasmine or whatever, Jest. I like Jest. You should have more of those because these run really quick. They're really easy to parallelize, and you should have a lot fewer of your service tests. Those would be I kind of think of them as BDD level tests, but those might be your integration tests. That might be the test that checks that this system is actually up where you expect it to be. If you have the fortune of developing on a production-like system, that's basically going to prove out that, yeah, that database I expect to see over there is over there. And and it's okay to have some integration tests. It's just that on your way up this pyramid, your tests get more fragile. And so you have to be a little bit more judicious about doing that. And then UI tests, be really, really, really sparing. You should have, 2 orders of magnitude more UI tests. So let's say I'm delivering a system and it has 100, it has maybe 200 unit tests. I might have 20, 30 integration level tests, service tests, and then I might have 5 max UI tests. And what a lot of places do is they will overweight toward the UI tests. Okay, coming up to the end of the kind of really quick introduction to BDD, it requires a high level of collaboration with the business. You cannot outsource this. This is a team level sport. And as with everything, your tests need to actually be meaningful, and they need to actually test what they're expecting to test. The test that's lying to you really delivers no value over the long term. And I'm gonna stop there and see if anyone has any questions on this, especially because I know that some people were kind of claiming that they were not very familiar with behavior-driven development.
As someone who is a younger developer on the team, how would you suggest that we approach this with our boss or our head?
So that's always an interesting conversation. I would try to talk to them about, well, first of all, I'm gonna send out the slides for this afterwards to everyone who's here. I would look at those benefits from beforehand, because if you can do behavior-driven development right, getting to continuous delivery is that much closer for you. So the business benefits are great, but that's often a really challenging one, because often the bosses are like, must go faster, must go faster. We need to meet the 5-year plan, comrade. They take that kind of attitude. And that's unfortunate, because that basically makes a they're optimizing exactly in the wrong place, right? If you can take the time to build quality in, you're going to have more time to work on new stuff, And sometimes it's just a question of going through your backlog and saying, okay, how much time does the team take fixing defects? And let's be honest, for some teams, it's like 50-70% of their sprints, right, will be just defect work. Well, that's ridiculous. That basically means you're stalled and not producing any new value. So that's how I would start to talk to it with your boss. Usually as a coach, I'm the person having that conversation. And usually it's a little bit safer for me as a coach because I'm coming in from the outside and they're paying money for me to come and spout off and exactly stuff like this. So it can be a more difficult conversation to have, but I would say talk to people within this group who have done this, who are able to deliver to production a lot quicker, and see what their experiences are. Does that help?
Yeah, it absolutely does. Thank you.
Sure. And also I also kind of sometimes take the attitude, why are we asking permission to do this?
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing. It's like you got to talk to your business partner a little bit to get the requirements. If they said, well, you don't have time to talk to them to start coding right away without understanding the problem, you would just say, I can't do that. So there's some things that are just implied in the process of getting your job done. You talk to the business partner, you understand the requirements, you write a unit test, you get it coded, you get it deployed. I think I saw in the book called Code Leader, define what done means up front. I talked to some developers and some of them, done means it's checked in the repository. Like, no, that's not done. I told the guy that's on my team. Done is you check it in, you call it a BA, you make sure they sign off on it, you deploy it to stage it and they sign off on it. And if you can't add a unit test as well. So I think if you have a good conversation on what done is and why you want to do those things, it might be easier sell, but because it's really hard for management just to enforce it, especially our manager, because it's more business driven. So they give us a lot of authority of how we run our technically. They don't try to prescribe it because they're business managers. So
yeah, but the thing that I've heard is if I'm working with a surgeon, I don't dictate to the surgeon whether or not the surgeon, he or she washes her hands before surgery. That's not up to me. Testing your stuff and making sure that your stuff is validatable as it gets checked in, that is a duty of care. That is professionalism, and that's maybe something that you should say, talk to the team about, get them to practice with, because sometimes you try it in a small way and you're like, wow, that really worked. And now I have this thing that's just not breaking. My experience was I tried it out on a small project and that project went into production and did not, I had 2 production defects in 2 years. That practically never happens. It certainly didn't happen to me before, and it practically hasn't happened after, except on systems that I've been able to use TDD and BDD on. So great question. And thank you for that. Because I do have a couple slides. I don't know, I might run out of time before we actually get to them. But here's the part about continuous delivery. So here's the secret about continuous delivery. And you'll see why behavior-driven development is, and test-driven development in a smaller extent, is such an important part of this. If you are going to do continuous delivery, your software must always be in a releasable state. Now, that sounds really easy to say. Your software is always releasable. I know for a fact that if I release this now, nothing's going to blow up. Again, that's a pretty big promise to make, but you need to have a repeatable, reliable process. Hence, the folks that said, yeah, we do this because we have a really robust Cicd pipeline. You automate nearly everything, including and especially your testing effort. You can, and security while you're at it, keep everything in version control. And I like this rule. This is a rule that Dave Farley and Jess Humble said in Continuous Delivery, which is a book I'd recommend to pretty much everybody who's interested in the DevOps space. If it hurts, do it more often. The reason why companies avoid deploying code to production is because of the 2 a.m. in the middle of the night wake ups. You got to get on this, something broke, right? It's a very, very painful process, and it's so painful that they avoid doing it. Well, the way out of that is not to do it less, it's actually to do it more, and to do it in smaller chunks, because every time you give a smaller chunk into production, you're risking less. You know, you can prove out its testability a little bit more, and if anything breaks, you immediately know what you worked on. You know, if I'm releasing something and it's something I worked on over the last week, I probably know where the bodies are buried. If it's 4 months from now, yeah, good luck. I might or might not, right? And you build quality in, which is obviously the entire point of behavior-driven development and test-driven development. So, and just to hammer it home, if it hurts, do it more frequently. Bring the pain forward. Don't let your fear dictate your ability to deliver, because it'll keep doing so. Okay, so everyone's familiar with the Cicd pipeline. The whole point of the Cicd pipeline, though, is if you're doing it right, if your code is always in a releasable state, then by the time it gets around to the end, you can guarantee that it is releasable as is. And that's the part where suddenly people are like, yeah, I'm not so sure my code is in that kind of state, right? So basically, whatever you're working on, simply write more automation for it. Automate your security code. I was playing around the other day with OWASP Zap, and man, that was a big eye opener. And you can automate that into your CI/CD pipeline, right? The whole idea is that by the time it gets around to here, bam, you're good. And then, you know, you can put it in an artifact repository, maybe even JFrog's artifact repository, since they're good enough to give away stuff, to come here and give away stuff. Which, by the way, I'm flattered that you come here. So here's the way to think about DevOps. I think about it kind of like the skill tree for civilization. I don't know how many of you have played this. I got this scenario from Mirko Herring, who is one of the genuine thought leaders on DevOps at Accenture. He's basically the head. James, correct me if I'm wrong. He's like the head of the DevOps practice, like worldwide, right?
Yeah, he's the global DevOps practice lead for Accenture.
Yeah. His idea was, you basically, so you work on the non-sexy stuff because that's going to empower the stuff down the road. And if you've ever played Civilization, you know that, like, you learn pottery or you learn animal husbandry or something like that, and then down the road, eventually you can do space exploration. But basically, you're taking these skills and you're getting your skilling up in each of them. So what I'm kind of doing is don't necessarily go, well, definitely try out containerization, but don't forget the vegetable type stuff. TDD and BDD is kind of like your broccoli back here. They are kind of like the animal husbandry of this. You learn how to do these, and you can start to do continuous integration, trunk-based development, feature flags, and they will help you get to continuous deployment or continuous delivery, whichever one works for you. All right, so continuous integration and why feature branching is evil. James has seen some of these slides before. This was basically my going through why trunk-based development was a thing. So most of the people who work, especially people who work in Git, especially if you're working with something like Bitbucket that basically does this by default, you basically have trunk. As we said, trunk needs to always be in releasable state if you want to ever get to continuous deployment. And then you kind of branch off something that's always unit tested. If that's there goes feature A. Feature A is gone, and you're always going to make sure that it has a full set of tests, right? And then developer 2 comes out, and we know that if you've ever looked at these branching patterns in your various tools for this, you know that it's never this simple. It's usually like this one was taken 7 weeks ago, is still kind of chugging along in its own way. And what happens when you try to kind of integrate them back? Well, okay, first of all, to be safe, you're pulling from trunk every day. Good, that's a good practice. You're making sure that you're on track. And then you try to merge back, and blam, it's everybody always asks me, hey, what's the best way to merge back? And I said, you're not going to like my answer, but let me walk you through why. It's always going to be a big bang effort, and you want to get away from big bang efforts. And this is, I actually want to thank James for introducing me to this little GIF here, because this kind of shows you what all too often happens when you merge. Right? It's a mess. And especially if you're merging something that has lasted out in, out in its own little branch. Oops, stop. Especially if you've done something that's lasted out in its own little branch forever. So rather than doing this, what you can do is you can basically integrate back into trunk every day. And I do mean this every day, because if you are properly guarding your stuff with tests, then you will immediately notice in trunk if there are any blowups. Now, this is the part where when I teach this stuff, and if I'm in a room, you'll see people's faces go white, and you'll hear a little bit of screaming. Who here is this like, oh yeah, I know this stuff. This is fine. I kind of familiar with this.
Roger, I agree with you. A lot of developers don't like merging the main. Like when I create a branch, I always give it like a date timestamp, so it reminds me how long I've been away from the main trunk. So it encourages me to merge in the main often. But for some reason, people just like living in a feature branch, and I don't know why they do that. I see that a lot.
I would say it's kind of like fish don't notice the quality of the water they're swimming in so often. Until another fish who comes from cleaner water is like, wow, this stuff is disgusting. How do you swim here? Why don't you come swim over here? That's kind of what coaching feels like a lot of times. Yeah, but you're right. A lot of developers that will just take these long-lived branches and they will hold onto them. And 7 weeks from now, they'll attempt to merge and wonder why it all went horribly wrong. Right. So how do you stop? So obviously there's a problem here. And that is, wait, whoa. I'm working on a feature that's not necessarily releasable. And this is where we get into how you separate release from deployment, because that's important if you're going to get to real continuous integration. Right? So let's think about an integration where, this guy is working on code that changes how orders are accepted. This person is working on products. They try to integrate into trunk, and everything goes pear-shaped, as they say. Because he's using old product code, his stuff breaks because she's using an old order workflow, her stuff breaks, it's a mess. So what do we need? We need a way to hide functionality until it's finished. And if you're familiar at all with feature flags, this is exactly where I'm going. So, it's no big mystery here. You allow incremental changes to be merged into trunk, even if it's currently in an unusable state. And if you try to do this without test-driven development and behavior-driven development, good luck to you, because I would not want to be you. Just one word of warning: there was a hedge fund who attempted to run with feature flags without really working on the quality of their code, and they lost some ridiculous amount of money. They lost something like 500 million on one trade, because as soon as the system woke up, the new stuff started working, and bam, they went bankrupt. So there are big risks to doing this. You really need to be able to have predictable behavior for your system, right? And again, if you know about feature flags, I can kind of breeze through this, but basically a feature flag is just, if you have a new feature, you can turn it on in your system and it'll use that. Otherwise it'll fail back to using the old system. And if you want to do A/B testing, if you want to do partial rollouts, if you want to do any kind of little experiments, if you want to roll out to like 2% and then 4% and then maybe eventually roll out to everybody, you need this. That said, it's risky, and again, you need to have absolutely dependable code if you're going to do this. So now, once you're at the point, if you have the kind of engineering discipline to be able to do this, then your trunk is always in a deployable state, and you can just check your code right into trunk. And I have worked with teams that just check into trunk. They just do that all day. And I've even worked with teams that check into trunk and use feature flags. I've even worked with teams that do this without a particularly strong TDD, BDD discipline. It can work. Again, you're taking a rather huge risk. And then the feature switched on only when you want to release it. And you can be really, really sophisticated with that. There are, there's I'm gonna forget the name of some of the systems that do this, but basically you can have a database in the background if you want to, saying, hey, turn that thing on. And then immediately, if you see that there's something wrong in production, bam, roll it back. You're now completely not dependent on deployment, because too often people still consider deployment to be released to production. All right. That was a kind of really, really, really quick waltz through that. Does it make sense, though, that if you're going to continuously integrate into trunk, you really, really, really need good test automation backing you up? All right. In the last couple minutes that I have here, and we're gonna run out of time pretty quickly. Here's the whole objection to, oh, but our managers won't let us. You basically don't let the managers dictate how you do your work. If you have an empowered team, then the team should be able to say, hey, look, we're building quality in. We know the value of what we're doing. Don't come and tell us not to unit test. That's ridiculous. That's not a risk we're willing to take with, by the way, your business. Right? And here's the other thing, the whole, oh, I don't write tests, they slow us down too much. And tests definitely, putting a heavy amount of tests in early does slow you down. But most of the time, think about this is kind of an entire value stream, if you will, from, hey, I got an idea for something, to it's out in production, right? And if you think about Scrum makes this part really agile at the expense of everything else, right? We can get it really, really, really fast through this sliver. And then what? It's an optimization at exactly the wrong time. If you really want to measure your results, that you're getting the results you want, measure from up here to all the way down there. Take that as your cycle time and then reduce that down, because you will find that as your quality goes up, as you layer your tests in more and more, that certainly the time that you're releasing is going to go way down. Is going to go, significantly, orders of magnitude. Suddenly you will have been doing quarterly releases. You'll be able to release every day with no worries, right? And also, it's again, software could spend 80% of its time in maintenance. So think about the maintenance costs and try to minimize for those, because it's going to spend a relatively small amount of time here. All right, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the book Accelerate by Nicole Forsgren, Jess Humble, and Gene Kim. If you haven't read it, and you feel like you want to make at least some kind of a fact and statistical based case for doing some DevOps practices, read it. Let's just, anyone want to say, has anyone not read this book?
I haven't read it, but I listened to this podcast by Jeffrey Palermo, Azure DevOps, and he mentioned this book like a month ago. But yeah, I think that book and like the Phoenix Project and yep. I think one more that he recommended. I'm trying to think about it.
DevOps Handbook?
Yeah, that's it. The yellow one.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm looking at the case right now.
Those are kind of the holy trinity. This one, though, they really studied, and they now are up to something like 31,000 companies that they've studied, and they've studied what makes companies that have fast development and slow development. And surprise, surprise, test-driven development and behavior-driven development are a big enabler of speed. So again, the whole "it's going to make us go slower" is a bit of a canard. It's not a thing. It does not. It will make you initially slower so that you can speed up later. And the speed up can be amazing if you know what you're doing and if you pay attention. And I reintroduced these statistics because it's one of these things where unless you're going to look at these and say, yeah, I don't believe any of that, which plenty of people are perfectly capable of doing. I look at these, I'm like, why wouldn't you do that? How could you look at that and say, oh, we can't afford to do this? No, we want crappier code. That gets us where we need to go. I don't understand the thinking behind there. I really don't. You know, and again, getting to continuous integration, getting to continuous deployment requires you to have always releasable code, which requires you to automate almost everything. And BDD and TDD is at least automating your tests. And with that, I want to thank every single one of you, including those of you who just showed up because you were getting into what's it, JFrog Swamp Up free. But I want to say, are there any questions at this point? Anyone want to
Hey, Roger.
want to talk about?
Hey, Roger, before we take a question, I did want to mention, because Leonard's got to go here in a second, but part of the meetup, we actually partnered up with the Tampa QA meetup to help kind of bring this all together. So I wanted Leonard to have a few minutes here. If you're still on, I'm happy for you to give a couple words about your group, Leonard.
Yeah, hi James, thanks. Yeah, hi everyone, my name is Linar. I run the largest QA group here in Tampa Bay area, and we talk all things related to software testing, and we have over 600 members, and I see some people here attending from our group as well. So thanks to James, we were able to work on this meetup together, and I hope our collaborations will continue in the future. And BDD is a controversial topic for both technical and business folks. And thanks, Roger, for clarifying a few things that we had some doubts about and some concerns. And I'm going to drop the link to our meetup group in case if anyone is interested. And I will see you next time. Thanks.
All right, thank you. And I'm glad to help in any way. Thank you.
All right, so we'll open up for some questions. And this is probably a good time. And Roger, I just want to thank you for meeting with us and presenting. It was quite a pleasure. If anybody wants to drop, feel free to drop. But if you want to hear any of the questions that folks want to ask of Roger and see what those answers are, please feel free to hang on. Well, Roger, I'm gonna say you must have done a fantastic job if nobody has any questions.
Or the opposite. We don't know.
I can list one more benefit of BDD. A lot of times coders have a tendency to like, what you just want to hack code. And if you don't know how to write a test, or you can't think of it with the test, that means you really don't understand the requirement that well. So yeah, if it's straight up TDD, you might have like a unit test for a repository you created. But when BDD, if you use the language of the business domain, it forces you to understand the problem. You can't just start hacking code away if you don't know the problem really well. So that's why I kind of like BDD as well. What I'll do sometimes in C#, I'll use MS Test, but I'll use nested classes. So when you see your test explorer, it reads in a very BDD-ish type way. So it makes your test more readable, and like you said it yourself, it documents your system. So yeah. And there was I was talking to this one guy a long time ago. This is before TypeScript got really popular. And I remember I asked him, isn't it overkill to write unit tests for JavaScript? And he countered to me and said, what's the first thing you do in C#? Compile my code. Bingo. He was saying it's like you might get it to work by accident in JavaScript. This is before TypeScript came out. You could compile your stuff. But the point he was trying to get at, it's not overkill to write unit tests. It's another type of verifying your system. You compile it, you run these tests. It's the same thing. And now you have TypeScript, which kind of does a initial check for you. So
yeah, I spent a solid year working in pure JavaScript, and man, that's a year of my life I'm never getting back. It's like anyone who has any doubts about TypeScript at this point, just know. And it's like it's far more important, especially if you have a system that's looser with typing like that you have some kind of unit test there, that you have a test to guarantee what it's doing. Because what happens with JavaScript, it won't report anything wrong. It'll just come back and say, hey, that thing that you're talking to doesn't have anything in it.
At runtime.
You're like, yeah, at runtime. And the console is not really helpful. There's apparently a system coming out to help with the console messages that come out of JavaScript. I forget the name of it, but I'm like, I want to learn more about that because it's always something that the good luck getting any messages that you can actually read out of JavaScript. All right. Oh, and somebody is learning mob programming. Good for you.
I have a question actually, Roger. Can I ask you a question?
Please, yeah.
So I understand the pros of BDD, but what if business people don't want to see the gherkin-based BDD style test? Is it still?
They never need to.
As a QA, I always thought that BDD is actually like more required from business side rather than technical stakeholders.
It requires the business side to show up. And it requires the business side, first of all, what is the one thing that the business side is definitely providing? They are providing, probably in some high level language, your acceptance criteria, right? So this story, when I deliver, it's going to do this, this, and this. And I think it's a mistake. I've heard some people say that you should express those in Gherkin. I think that's a mistake. And here's why. If you look, and Matt Wynn has a really great blog post, and I've used this technique with teams. It's a fantastic technique. He has a blog post about example mapping, and I'll post that in the meetup. I will I'll post it. I'll put in the meetup comments when I share out the slides and when I talk about that. But if you use that, you can basically keep everything in high level language. And what you do is you put up your story, you put up your acceptance criteria, and then you put up the scenarios that you're going to test for. They can still be in a high level language that the business understands, and the business doesn't have to touch Gherkin at all, which is fine, because then the team can come in and just translate those scenarios right into Gherkin. They ought to fit. They ought to be a really quick translation. And bam, Gherkin can be understood by the business, but I don't think there's an absolute requirement that the business has to be up on their Gherkin. And especially not if you fall into the anti-pattern where you're like defining a lot of buttons and a lot of screens, and a lot of, and user pushes this to go to the next screen, and then we go to the next screen, and then we go to the next screen. If you got Gherkin like this, it's just fingernails on a blackboard for anyone to read in the first place, let alone someone whose job is not technical. So I think it absolutely can be done so that the business doesn't have to be up on Gherkin. I think you can run BDD. BDD is not using Gherkin. BDD is not using Cucumber. BDD is the communication and the defining of your tests in such a way that there's absolute guaranteed alignment to the acceptance criteria. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks, Roger. Makes sense.
Sure.
Hey, Roger, I had one question. When you go to these companies and try to encourage BDD or TDD, a problem, and I don't know if the problem is sometimes our management, there's not like a benevolent dictator on what technology stack to use. So we have different tribes. We have some people on our team doing React and Angular. So it's almost hard. It's easy to learn enough to be dangerous in the technology, but they get good where you start writing in a very TDD way. You have to learn it well and learn how to make testable architectures. Is that like a pattern you see a lot where just people have their own path? I'm passionate about this type of stuff, so it's not hard for me to want to do this, but it's hard for me to push it on the rest of my team because they have like, I want to learn .NET Core first, I want to learn Kubernetes first. Like testing always gets automated, tests always gets put in the back burner over and over, and the technology changes all the time. And I almost feel like I was pushing back my passion because I had to learn a newer technology stack because one of the senior devs says, well, you have to use this stack for the next project. Do we really have to use that latest stack for the next project? Can I try to use our current stack and learn how to do it in the TDD way versus every half a year learn a different stack, it seems? So I'm just wondering if that's like a common thing among developers when you go to different companies.
It's not uncommon. It seems like your question has a lot to unpack there. So the first thing is teams using different technologies, and there's always the rush to learn the next technology, and automated testing is not sexy. It it is eating your broccoli, right?
Yeah.
So yes, there is trouble. It's always difficult getting teams to do it. And then you come into problems like you mentioned Angular. Angular has something called test bed that they have as part of their test suite. And it's ridiculous. It's awful. I recommend people just don't bother using it, because what it does is it basically cranks up the entire component structure in advance of running each individual test. And there's literally no way to crank it up and leave it lazy in the background. So it's a pile of crap. And so I talk to people about, okay, what can they do? And I've worked with teams that are deep into Angular, and their tests just take forever to run, so that doesn't help with unit testing. React is kind of cool because they got Jest on their side, and Jest is actually pretty darn awesome. But it's like, I think the best way is to start with the question of value, right? To start with the value that's bringing to your organization if everyone can get their act together and do tests. Because then the most important thing is you got the managers who if they get it, and I have been in organizations where I've kind of shamed managers into figuring out why it's a good thing to be able to give the team space to test. They will back off and leave and let teams play around with it. Teams will then demonstrate, hey, and we've got this thing, and because we used TDD and BDD on it, we know that this thing will never break again, as we're delivering it. They will, they'll play around with a little bit of UI, and they'll say, hey, there's this cumbersome process we've always had to do. Well, we've coded it once, we never have to actually physically do that again. And I think as soon as the wins start coming in, then it becomes a little bit easier to snowball, but you're always going to have some level of resistance because it's not fun. What it is it's a safer way to go. So
I think that was more of a soapbox for me than it was a question, I guess.
It's frustrating. It's frustrating talking to folks, and some folks, some folks just don't get it. But I think the big thing is to get it into the culture of your organization that, hey, we're going to do this now because this is the only way we're going to get to continuous deployment, right? Or continuous delivery, whichever one you want. All right, I have a hard stop at the top of the hour, so I've got about 9 more minutes. Anyone else have any more questions? And actually, Charles, if you have more questions, feel free, because can I just say,
what unit testing frame would you use for Angular, or at least recommend? Just Jasmine?
Oh, let me get back to you, because I actually corresponded with a team that I worked with.
Yeah.
And there are some alternatives to testbed. I just think, because I'm actually also working with a colleague now. So do you want to email me your, oh wait, we got a message. Do you want to email me your email or something like that? I can get it, or I can put it into, because Angular testing is like one of those, it ought to be a nicer story than it is.
Okay.
Thanks, Pooja.
I'll send a message to you directly. I'll just put it in the chat window. Yeah, I can do it right here.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm pretty good at writing my tests on like the server side, the web API, C# MS test. I've been pretty good at making that a habit. The client side stuff, I haven't really made that a habit yet. So I'm trying to get better at that.
Yeah, my thing with especially with the front end, it's like, how important is it that you actually have a system that's hitting that button? It's like, maybe you just look at the function that's called underneath that, and a lot of times with Angular, it's like you're testing this entire framework that you don't really need.
You ever read like Uncle Bob, like clean code? I think he always recommended it. He was always encouraged against kind of going through the UI, do it right behind the sleeve. So usually you said it earlier, like, do you really need to test that? You're not gonna test the C# property bag. I mean,
right. Yeah,
that you're going to unit test stuff that actually has logic. If there's an if else in it, then write a unit test for it.
Right. It's also my problem with mocking. Like, I cannot tell you how many times I come in, I see a team, they have mocked the response for an API. Okay, great. Now you have a tight coupling between the actual API and that mocked API. And then their unit test is to call the mock and to get a response back. congratulations, your test means nothing. You know, you've created a maintenance nightmare for yourself down the road, and it doesn't really help. You know, so that's a lot of the times what I'll do when I'm designing these systems is I'll take the results of API calls, I'll repack them into domain specific objects. Now I've got these objects that are testable. I can use, just the ones that I need.
Yeah.
And my system is that much more testable, immediately. Especially if you have a data heavy system, that can get a little onerous, just creating all those objects, but I've never seen it not be worth it.
Yeah.
Just for the testability it gives you.
Cool. Thanks.
Awesome, Roger. So we are pretty much right at the end. I did want to thank you again for doing it. This was awesome. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And if you have any questions, Roger, anything you want to share with the group from materials, links, etc., I usually send out a follow-up email. I can include those in a correspondence in that way.
Sounds good. Yep, I'll send you them tonight. I'll send you the slides. I'll send you some resources that, some online resources, books that have helped me. We'll go from there.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you so much,
Well,
James.
thank you, everybody. Thanks for attending, and hope you have a great evening.
All right. Thanks, Roger. Thanks, James.
Thank you. Thanks for the great questions. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Roger.
Thanks, Bucha.
It was so much
Thanks
fun.
for being here. Yep.
Okay, bye.